The Galactic Senate had stood for 50,000 years, and in all that time, the 4,000 species that filled its vast chamber had never agreed on anything. They argued about trade routes and territorial boundaries. They fought wars that lasted centuries. And they held grudges that spanned generations beyond counting. But on this day, something changed. Ambassador Thylix of the Velan Dominion stood at his observation post high above the Senate floor, his 4 eyes watching the impossible unfold beneath him. Species that had hated each other since before recorded history were now clasping hands and tentacles and manipulator appendages in gestures of alliance. The crystalline hegemony, beings of living glass who communicated through light, reached out to touch the representatives of the Spore Collective, a fungal network species they had tried to exterminate 3 times in the past millennium. The Void Swimmers, massive creatures who lived in the empty spaces between stars, signed formal treaties with the Solar Ascendancy, their mortal enemies for 10,000 years. Thylix felt a chill run through his scaled body as he watched. He had lived for 300 years and served as ambassador for 100 of them. And he had never seen anything like this. "It is because of them," said a voice beside him. And Thylix turned to see his old mentor, Elder Vothrak, standing in the shadows with his ancient eyes full of fear. "The humans," Thylix said. And the word felt strange on his tongue. "Yes," Vothrak replied. "The humans have done what no conqueror, no plague, no cosmic catastrophe has ever managed to do. They have united us all." Thylix looked back at the Senate floor where the formal declarations were being made. The Grand Concord, they called it, an alliance of every known spacefaring civilization with a single purpose: to contain humanity before it was too late. 300 years. That was all the time the humans had been part of galactic society. And yet, they had already changed everything. Thylix remembered when the first human ships had appeared at the edge of known space. They were crude vessels, barely capable of faster-than-light travel, crewed by soft and fragile beings who should have died 1,000 times over just reaching the stars. The Galactic Senate had laughed at them, these small creatures from a world so dangerous that it had been classified as a death world and marked as uninhabitable. But the humans did not die. They spread across the galaxy with a speed that terrified every species that watched them. They settled on worlds that other races had abandoned, planets with crushing gravity and toxic atmospheres and predators that could tear through military-grade armor. They not only survived on these death worlds, but thrived there, building colonies and cities and civilizations. "They do not conquer with weapons," Vothrak said quietly, his voice trembling with age and worry. "They conquer with friendship. And that is far more dangerous than any army." Thylix knew what his mentor meant. The humans had done something no other species had ever managed. They had befriended the Wraithkin. Wraithkin were nightmares given form. Shadow creatures from the darkest regions of space who fed on fear and could slip through solid matter like ghosts. Entire star systems evacuated when the Wraithkin approached, and civilizations that had lasted millions of years crumbled at their touch. They were the monsters that made other monsters afraid, and the humans had made them friends. No one knew how they had done it. Some said that human minds were somehow immune to the fear the Wraithkin projected. Others claimed that humans were simply too stubborn to run away. Whatever the reason, the Wraithkin now considered humanity their closest allies, and that alone had sent shock waves through the galaxy. But it was not just the Wraithkin. The humans made friends everywhere they went. They had found the Mockrol dying from the withering plague, a disease that had killed 90% of their population. And human scientists had worked for decades to find a cure. When they succeeded, the Mockrol swore eternal loyalty to humanity. They had discovered the Singers of Distant Sorrow, a beautiful and ancient species whose homeworld was dying from a damaged star. And human engineers had spent a century terraforming a new planet for them. The singers now composed songs of gratitude that echoed across the void. They had encountered the Broken Ones, a species shattered by civil war and scattered across 100 worlds. And human diplomats had spent generations helping them heal and reunite. The Broken Ones now called humans their saviors. Everywhere the humans went, they left friends behind. They shared technology freely, asking nothing in return. They offered help to species that had never asked for it. They treated ancient enemies with kindness and ancient friends with loyalty, and this terrified the galaxy more than any weapon ever could. "They are changing us," Elder Vothrak said, gripping Thylex's arm with surprising strength. "Do you not see it? Our young people are starting to think like them, to act like them, to believe in the same foolish ideals of cooperation and kindness. If we do not stop them now, there will be nothing left of what we were." Tylex wanted to argue, wanted to say that perhaps change was not always bad, but he kept silent. He was young by Velen standards, and the old ways demanded that he listen to his elders below them. The final votes were cast, and the Grand Concord was officially formed. 12 million warships would be gathered from every corner of the galaxy, the largest fleet in recorded history, and they would assemble at the edge of human space. They would deliver an ultimatum: surrender all colony worlds, dismantle all military vessels, and submit to permanent quarantine on their homeworld of Earth if the humans refused. They would be destroyed. Tylex watched as celebration erupted across the Senate floor. Thousands of species rejoicing in their newfound unity. It should have been a moment of triumph, the greatest achievement of galactic civilization. And yet Tylex felt only a deep and terrible unease. He thought about the human ambassador he had met once at a trade conference. A small female with dark skin and kind eyes who had spoken of peace and understanding. She had seemed so genuine, so hopeful, and Tylex had found himself wanting to believe in the future she described. But Elder Vothrak was right. The humans were too dangerous precisely because they were not dangerous in the ways the galaxy understood. They did not conquer through force or intimidation. They conquered through something far more insidious. They conquered through love, and so the galaxy banded together against humanity, united by fear of creatures who wanted nothing more than to be friends. The Armada began to assemble, warships from every known species, gathering in numbers that had never been seen before. They prepared for a war against an enemy that had never attacked them, never threatened them, never done anything except offer kindness. Tylex stood at the edge of the observation deck and watched the celebrations continue below. Somewhere in his heart, he hoped that the humans would surrender peacefully, that the war would never have to happen. But another part of him, a part he did not want to acknowledge, whispered that the humans would not surrender. They would fight back, not with weapons, but with something else entirely, and the galaxy was not ready for what was coming. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin stood on the bridge of the UES Perseverance and read the ultimatum for the third time. The words had not changed, but she found herself hoping that somehow they might 30 standard cycles. That was all the time humanity had been given to surrender everything they had built. Every colony and outpost and dream they had nurtured across 3 centuries of expansion. They were to dismantle their ships, abandon their worlds, and return to Earth to live under permanent quarantine. Watched over by the very species they had tried to help, she set down the datapad and looked out at the stars beyond the viewport. Somewhere out there, 12 million alien warships were gathering, the combined military might of 4,000 civilizations united against humanity. It was the largest fleet in galactic history, and it was coming for her people, Admiral, said Commander Rodriguez, her second in command. "The Senate is requesting our response. They seem impatient." Chun smiled slightly at that. Of course they were impatient. They had expected humanity to panic, to beg, to grovel for mercy. Instead, humanity had said nothing. For 29 cycles, the humans had remained silent. No diplomatic messages, no counteroffers, no desperate pleas. Just silence that grew heavier and more unsettling with each passing day. Chen had spent those 29 cycles preparing, not for war in the way the aliens expected, but for something else entirely. She had sent quiet messages to old friends across the galaxy, call-in favors that had never been asked for, and reminded certain species of debts they had chosen to remember now on the 30th cycle. It was time to respond. Send the following message to the Grand Concord Fleet, Chun said, her voice calm and steady. We decline your ultimatum, and we forgive you for not understanding what you have done. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow but transmitted the message without question. She had served under Admiral Chun for 20 years and had learned to trust her even when her orders seemed strange across the void. Fleet Commander Vajrath of the Crystalline Hegemony received humanity's response and felt what his species called the singing of rage. His crystalline body hummed with barely contained fury as he processed the words. They declined. These soft, fragile creatures who had barely mastered faster than light travel 3 centuries ago were declining to surrender to the greatest military force ever assembled. And worse, they offered forgiveness, as if the galaxy needed the forgiveness of being so small and weak. They mock us, Vajra said to his assembled commanders, his voice ringing like struck glass. They think us fools. Very well, we shall show them what happens to those who mock the Grand Concord. The Armada advanced toward the Sol system, 12 million warships moving in perfect formation across the darkness of space. Their sensors had already detected humanity's defensive fleet, and the readings made Vajrath laugh in a shower of light. 47 ships. Humanity had mustered 47 warships to defend their homeworld against 12 million. They have gone mad with despair, Vajrath declared. Their tiny minds could not comprehend the forces arrayed against them, and so they have broken. This will not even be a battle. It will be an execution. The Concord fleet crossed into the Sol system with weapons charged and shields raised. They expected desperate resistance, perhaps a futile last stand. What they found instead made every commander in the Armada freeze in shock. The Wraithkin emerged from shadow space like nightmares given form. 800,000 vessels materialized around the human fleet. Ships of living darkness that defied every law of physics the galaxy understood. The fear that preceded them washed across the Concord Armada, causing panic in species that had not felt true terror in millennia. Impossible, Vajrath whispered, his crystalline form flickering with disbelief. They swore neutrality. They have never joined any conflict in recorded history. But the Wraithkin were not alone. More ships appeared, wave after wave of reinforcements from every corner of the galaxy. The Makral came first, 300,000 vessels crewed by the survivors of the withering plague, the species that humanity had saved from extinction. Their ships were old and battered, but their crews were ready to die for the people who had given them life. Then came the singers of distant sorrow, their beautiful crystalline vessels humming with harmonics that made even Vajrath's warriors weep. They had not fought a war in 10,000 years, but they had rebuilt their military in secret, preparing for the day when they could repay the debt they owed to humanity. The broken ones arrived next, their reunified fleets flying in formation for the first time in centuries. Species after species appeared, each one owing their survival or their prosperity to human kindness. Each one ready to stand with humanity against the Galaxy Admiral. Chun watched the reinforcements arrive and felt tears forming in her eyes. She had hoped that humanity's friends would remember them, but she had never expected this. Nearly 2 million ships now surrounded the human fleet, crewed by species who had chosen friendship over fear. Admiral, Rodriguez said softly, we are receiving a transmission from the Wraithkin flagship. Chun nodded, and a voice filled the bridge, a voice like darkness given sound. Cold and ancient and terrifying humans, the Wraith King commander said. "You showed us kindness when all others showed us fear. You looked upon us without hatred when every other species fled in terror. You gave us friendship when we had known nothing but loneliness for 1,000,000 years. Today, we repay that debt. Today, we stand with you." Similar messages came from every allied fleet. Words of gratitude and loyalty that made Chun's heart swell with pride. Humanity had spent 3 centuries making friends, not because they expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Now, those friends had come to stand beside them. Fleet Commander Vosrath stared at his tactical displays with growing horror. The numbers had shifted dramatically, and while the Concorde still held the advantage, it was no longer the overwhelming superiority they had counted on. Worse, the allied species included some of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. "This changes nothing," Vosrath declared, forcing confidence into his voice. "We still outnumber them. We will crush them and their treacherous allies together." But even as he gave the order to advance, Vosrath felt the first stirrings of doubt. The humans had known the Armada was coming. They had known they were outnumbered, and yet they had remained calm. They had spent 29 cycles in silence, and now Vosrath understood why they had been calling for help. And help had answered. The battle for humanity's survival was about to begin. But it would not be the battle anyone expected. Admiral Chun had no intention of destroying the Concorde fleet. She had something else in mind entirely. Something that would change the galaxy forever. She looked out at the stars and smiled. The galaxy had banded together against humanity, but humanity had friends too. Friends who were willing to fight and die for the species that had shown them kindness and friendship. Chun knew was the most powerful weapon in the universe. The first shots of the war were fired on a cold morning in the void between stars. And everything that happened after defied every expectation. The galaxy had built over 50,000 years of conflict. Fleet Commander Vosrath ordered his warships forward with absolute confidence. Yes, the humans had allies, but the Concorde still held numerical superiority, and numbers won wars. That was the oldest truth of galactic warfare. The battle began as battles always began, with ships maneuvering for position and weapon systems locking onto targets. Vosrath watched his tactical display with the cold satisfaction of a predator closing in on wounded prey. The human fleet was good, surprisingly good. But they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Then something strange happened. A squadron of human vessels broke through the Concorde line and surrounded a Velen battleship. They had the ship at their mercy, weapons charged, and targeting systems locked. The Velen crew prepared for death, sending final messages to their families across the void. But the killing blow never came instead. The human ships deployed something the Concorde had never seen before: focused electromagnetic pulses that shut down the Velen ship's weapon systems without damaging anything else. The battleship went dark, its guns silent, but its life support and communications remained intact. "What are they doing?" Vosrath demanded. Watching more Concorde ships suffer the same fate, disabled but not destroyed, crippled but not killed across the battlefield. The pattern repeated itself. Human vessels and their allies fought with devastating efficiency, but they did not fight to kill. They fought to disable, to capture, to neutralize. Ships that should have been debris floating in the void were instead intact. Their crews alive but helpless. "They are wasting resources," one of Vosrath's commanders suggested. They could destroy those ships and remove them from the battle entirely. But Vosrath was not so sure. Something about this felt wrong, felt planned in a way he could not understand. The humans were not trying to win the war. They were trying to do something else entirely. On the bridge of the Perseverance, Admiral Chun issued orders with calm precision. Her tactical officers reported capture after capture, disabled ship after disabled ship, and Chun nodded with satisfaction. "The plan was working, Admiral," Commander Rodriguez said. We have captured 18 Concord vessels in this sector alone. What do you want us to do with the prisoners? Treat them with kindness, Chum replied. Feed them, tend to their wounds, learn their names. Show them who we really are. Rodriguez smiled and relayed the orders. Across the human fleet, the same instructions were being followed. Captured aliens were being treated not as prisoners, but as guests, given food and medical care and conversation. Human Marines who had trained for years in combat spent their time talking to frightened aliens about their families and their homes. The Concord commanders could not understand what they were seeing. Their intelligence officers intercepted human communications that made no sense. Orders to use minimal force, instructions to preserve enemy lives. Reminders that every alien they faced was someone's child or parent or friend. They are weak, a hegemony admiral declared. Their soft hearts will be their downfall. But as the days passed, the Concord began to realize that something far more dangerous than weakness was at work. Prisoners began returning to Concord space, released by the humans without conditions. They came back with stories that spread like wildfire through the fleet. Stories of human medics who worked through the night to save alien lives. Of human officers who apologized for the war. Of human soldiers who showed photographs of their own families and asked about the families of their captives. Veteran lieutenant named Korath became famous throughout the Concord when he returned to his ship with tears in his eyes. He had been captured during a boarding action, his leg badly wounded, and he had expected to die in a human prison instead. A human medic named Sarah had spent 6 hours in surgery saving his life. She had not slept, had not eaten, had pushed herself to exhaustion to save an enemy soldier she had never met. When Korath woke up, she was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand. "I am sorry," she had said in broken Velen, words she had learned just to comfort him. "I am sorry we are at war. I hope one day we can be friends." Korath told this story to everyone who would listen, and the effect on Concord morale was devastating. Soldiers who had been ready to die fighting monsters found themselves wondering if the humans were monsters at all. Officers who had given orders to show no mercy began questioning whether mercy might be the wiser path. Ambassador Thylix, now serving as an emergency liaison between the Concord Command and the Senate, sent increasingly desperate messages home. His reports painted a picture that the senators could not comprehend. "We are not losing a war," Thylix wrote. "We are being taught a lesson. Every battle we fight shows us our own cruelty reflected against their kindness. Every prisoner they release comes back with stories that make our soldiers question why they are fighting. They are not trying to defeat us. They are trying to change us." Fleet Commander Vosrath refused to accept this analysis. He pushed his forces harder, demanded more aggression, ordered his captains to show the ruthlessness that had built the great empires of the galaxy. But his orders rang hollow now, and his crews obeyed with growing reluctance. The war continued for 9 weeks, and in that time, the largest conflict in galactic history produced fewer than 1,000 casualties. Battles involving millions of ships ended with hundreds of disabled vessels and almost no deaths. The humans fought with technology the Concord had never imagined. Weapons designed not to kill, but to neutralize. Tactics developed not for victory, but for preservation, and with every passing day, the Concord's will to fight eroded. A little more. Veterans who had served in a dozen wars found themselves unable to pull the trigger when they looked through their targeting systems. They had seen too many returning prisoners with stories of human kindness. They had heard too many accounts of enemies who treated them like friends. They had received too many messages from captured comrades who begged them to stop fighting. Morale did not break. It evaporated, vanishing like mist in morning sunlight. Tlix watched the reports coming in and felt something he had not expected to feel: hope. The humans were not winning the war through force. They were winning it through something far more powerful. They were proving that there was another way to resolve conflicts. A way that did not require death and destruction and centuries of hatred. He thought about Elder Vothrak's warnings, about the fear that humans would change the galaxy. Perhaps, Thylix realized, change was exactly what the galaxy needed. The final days of the war were not marked by great battles or dramatic last stands. Instead, they were marked by a growing silence as Concord ships stopped fighting and simply waited. Commanders who had sworn to destroy humanity found themselves unable to give the orders. Soldiers who had trained for years in combat found themselves laying down their weapons, and through it all, the humans kept treating their enemies with kindness, kept releasing prisoners with stories of compassion, kept proving that friendship was stronger than fear. When the surrender finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. The Grand Concord, the greatest military alliance in galactic history, admitted defeat not because they had been outfought, but because they had been outloved. The galaxy had banded together against humanity, and humanity had responded not with weapons, but with open arms. Now the galaxy had to decide what to do next, and the decision would change everything. The surrender ceremony took place on a neutral space station at the edge of human territory, and every species in the galaxy watched with breath held tight. 4,000 civilizations waited to learn their fate at the hands of the humans they had tried to destroy fleet. Commander Vajrath led the Concord delegation. His crystalline body dimmed with shame as he walked through corridors lined with human guards. He expected cruelty, expected humiliation, expected the kind of treatment that any galactic power would demand after such a victory. He had studied history, and history taught that victors always punished. The defeated Admiral Chen Wei-Lin met him in a simple room with no decorations, no symbols of triumph, no reminders of human superiority. She wore her dress uniform but carried no weapons, and her face showed no anger, no satisfaction, only a quiet sadness that Vajrath could not understand. "We are here to discuss terms," Vajrath said, forcing strength into his voice even as his light flickered with fear. "The Concord accepts defeat and awaits your demands." Chan nodded and gestured for him to sit. When they were both settled across from each other, she spoke words that shattered everything Vajrath thought he knew about war. "We demand nothing." Vajrath's form pulsed with confusion. Surely he had misunderstood. The translation systems must have failed somehow. "Nothing," he repeated. "You have won. You have the right to demand reparations, territories, the dissolution of the Concord. You could enslave us if you wished." "We could," Chen agreed, "but we will not. We do not want revenge, Fleet Commander. We never wanted this war at all." "Then what do you want?" Vajrath asked. And for the first time in his long military career, he felt completely lost. Chen leaned forward, her eyes meeting his photoreceptors with an intensity that made him want to look away. "We want to understand," she said. "We want to know why you were so afraid of us. We want to talk, really talk, about what went wrong and how we can make it right." The Congress of Understanding began 1 month later, and it lasted for 3 years. Human diplomats sat with representatives of every species that had joined the Concord, and they asked the same question over and over. "Why were you afraid of us?" At first, the aliens gave political answers, talking about strategic concerns and balance of power. But the humans pushed deeper, asking questions that forced their former enemies to confront truths they had buried for millennia. The Velen delegation broke first. Ambassador Thylix, who had watched the war unfold with growing doubt, finally spoke the words his species had never admitted. "We were afraid because we recognized ourselves in you," he said, his voice trembling. "You rose so fast, you achieved so much. And we saw the pattern we had seen before. Every species that rises too quickly eventually becomes a monster. We have seen it happen 100 times, and we were certain it would happen with you. Similar confessions came from other species. The crystalline hegemony admitted that their own expansion had been built on conquest and genocide, and they assumed all species were the same. The void swimmers confessed that they had destroyed 3 emerging civilizations in their early history, and they feared humanity would do the same. The Spore Collective revealed that they had been on the verge of becoming galactic conquerors themselves before internal conflict tore them apart. The galaxy, it turned out, was haunted by its own history. Every major species carried guilt and fear from things they had done in their past, and they projected those fears onto humanity. They expected humans to become monsters, because they themselves had been monsters. Ambassador Sarah Okonkwo, who led the human delegation, listened to every confession with patience and compassion. She did not judge, did not condemn, did not use the admissions as weapons. Instead, she simply listened and tried to understand when the confessions were complete. She stood before the assembled representatives and did something that shocked them. All she confessed humanity's sins. "You are not entirely wrong to fear us," Okonkwo said, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. "Humanity has a dark history. We have waged wars of conquest against our own kind. We have committed genocides that wiped entire cultures from existence. We have destroyed our own environment through greed and carelessness. We have done terrible things to each other in the name of power and ideology and hatred." The chamber fell silent. No species had ever voluntarily admitted such things in a diplomatic setting. "We contain the capacity for great evil," Okonkwo continued. "This is true. But we also contain the capacity for great good. And more importantly, we have learned to choose. We have learned, through centuries of suffering and struggle, that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that cooperation achieves more than conquest, that love outlasts hatred." She paused, letting her words settle over the assembled delegates. "This is what we wanted to share with the galaxy. Not our technology, not our resources, but this simple truth, that monsters can choose to become something better. We know this because we have lived it, and we believe that you can live it too." The effect of her speech was profound. Species that had spent millennia believing that violence was the only path to survival began to question everything they had assumed. Delegates who had come to the Congress expecting punishment found themselves instead confronting their own history and their own potential for change. Ambassador Thylix would later call it the moment the galaxy grew up. For the first time in 50,000 years, the great civilizations began to talk honestly about their pasts and their futures. Old grudges were examined and found wanting. Ancient hatreds were questioned and sometimes abandoned. The Congress of Understanding did not solve every problem. Species that had fought for millennia could not become friends overnight, but it planted seeds of change that would grow for generations to come. At the end of the 3 years, a new agreement was signed. Not a treaty of surrender or terms of peace, but a simple declaration of intent. The species of the galaxy agreed to try a different way, to choose cooperation over conflict, to give friendship a chance. Thylix watched the signing ceremony with tears in his ancient eyes. He thought about Elder Vothrak, who had died during the war, still believing that humans were the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. The old mentor had been wrong about so many things, but he had been right about one thing. The humans had changed everything. They had changed everything by showing the galaxy what it could become. Admiral Chun stood beside Ambassador Okonkwo as the ceremony concluded, watching thousands of species celebrate a future that had seemed impossible just 3 years before. She thought about all the battles she had fought, all the orders she had given to disable rather than destroy, to capture rather than kill. Was it worth it? Okonkwo asked quietly. All the fighting, all the planning, all the risk. Chun considered the question carefully before answering. "We could have won through force," she said. "We could have destroyed the Concord fleet and conquered the galaxy. We have allies who would have helped us do it. But then we would have become what they feared. We would have proven them right. She watched a Velen delegate embrace a human diplomat. Watched crystalline beings sharing light with Mokrol survivors. Watched the Wraithkin moving through the crowd without inspiring terror. This is better, Chung concluded. This is what humanity can be at its best. Not conquerors but friends. Not destroyers but healers. We showed the galaxy who we really are. And now they are learning to be who they really can be. The galaxy had banded together against humanity, and humanity had responded with mercy and understanding. Now the real work would begin. The slow and difficult process of building trust and friendship across the vast distances of space. But for the first time in galactic history, there was hope that it might actually succeed. 50 years had passed since the failed Concord War, and the galaxy was a different place. Ambassador Thylix stood at the viewing window of his retirement home on the Velen homeworld, watching young children play in the gardens below. They were not all Velen children. There were humans among them, and Mokrol, and even a young crystalline being whose light danced with joy as it chased its friends through the flowers. This was normal now. This mixing of species that had once been unthinkable. Children grew up with friends from across the galaxy, learning languages and customs that their grandparents had never imagined. They did not see differences where their ancestors had seen divisions. They simply saw friend Stylix had lived long enough to witness the transformation. And some days he could hardly believe what the galaxy had become. The Galactic Senate still existed, but it had changed beyond recognition. The endless arguments about territory and trade had given way to discussions about joint scientific projects and cultural exchanges. Species that had fought wars for millennia now collaborated on ventures that benefited everyone. Humans rarely attended the Senate meetings anymore. They did not need to. Their influence was felt in 1,000 other ways. Ways that were far more powerful than political representation. Human teachers worked in nurseries across crystalline space, helping young beings understand the importance of empathy and cooperation. The hegemony had once prided itself on cold logic and ruthless efficiency, but now its children learned that strength could come from compassion as well as calculation. Human engineers worked alongside void swimmers, helping them build their first permanent settlements in the spaces between stars. For millions of years, the void swimmers had wandered without a true home, but humanity had helped them imagine a different future. And now that future was becoming real, human artists collaborated with the singers of distant sorrow, creating works of beauty that made entire species weep with joy. Music and art that combined traditions from across the galaxy, creating something new and wonderful that belonged to everyone. Human doctors served in Mokrol hospitals, continuing the work that had begun when humanity cured the withering plague. The Mokrol had become close allies and partners, their gratitude transforming into genuine friendship over the decades. Even the Wraithkin had changed. They still inspired some fear, but they were no longer the isolated horrors they had once been. Human friendship had shown them that they did not have to be alone, and now they worked alongside other species in ways that would have seemed impossible 50 years before. Not everything had changed easily. Old fears did not disappear overnight, and there had been setbacks along the way. A movement of Velen ultranationalists had risen 20 years after the war, calling for a return to the old ways, demanding that aliens be expelled from Velen space. They had gathered followers among those who felt threatened by change, those who missed the certainty of hatred, but the movement had collapsed from within. And the reason for its failure showed just how much the galaxy had changed. Children of the ultranationalists refused to follow their parents. They had grown up with human friends, had played games with Mokrol classmates, had learned music from crystalline teachers. They could not hate species they had known and loved since birth. Young Velen stood before their own families and declared that they would not be part of a movement built on fear. They chose their friends over their parents' prejudices, and the ultranationalist movement withered and died. Thylax had watched this happen with amazement and hope. The young people of the galaxy were different from their ancestors in fundamental ways. They had grown up in a universe where cooperation was possible, where friendship crossed species boundaries, where the old hatreds seemed pointless and strange. This was humanity's greatest victory, greater than any military triumph could have been. They had changed not just the politics of the galaxy, but its very soul. Today was a special day. Thylax had been asked to give the final address of his career, a speech that would be broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. He had spent weeks preparing, trying to find words that could capture what he had witnessed and what he had learned. The broadcast center was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all waiting to hear what the ancient Velern ambassador would say. Thylax stood at the podium and looked out at faces that represented the diversity and unity of the new galaxy. 50 years ago, he began. His voice cracked with age but still clear. We gathered the greatest armada in history to destroy humanity. We believed they were a threat, a danger that had to be eliminated. We were united by fear, the most powerful force the galaxy had ever known. He paused, letting the memory settle over the assembly. We were wrong. A murmur ran through the crowd. But Thylax continued. We thought humanity would conquer us. Instead, they conquered something else. They conquered our loneliness. They conquered our despair. They conquered the lie that the universe must be cruel because it has always been cruel. His bioluminescent skin flickered with emotion as he spoke. We tried to band together against humanity. Now we are banded together with them. And I have never been more grateful to have been so utterly and completely wrong. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Thylax barely heard it. He was thinking about all the changes he had witnessed, all the friendships he had seen form across the boundaries of species and culture and history on Earth. In a small house near the coast of what humans called California, Admiral Chen Wei-Lin watched the broadcast with her family gathered around her. She was old now, retired for decades, but her eyes were still sharp and her mind was still clear. Grandchildren sat at her feet, 5 of them ranging in age from 6 to 16. They had been asking questions about the war, about the time when the galaxy had tried to destroy humanity and humanity had responded with mercy. Grandmother, the youngest, asked, a girl with Chun's stubborn eyes and her grandfather's gentle smile. Why were the aliens so afraid of us? Chun smiled and reached down to stroke her granddaughter's hair. Because they did not know us yet, she said. They had only heard stories and seen our ships. They did not know who we really were. And now, the girl asked, do they know us now? Chun looked at the broadcast, at Ambassador Thylax speaking words of gratitude and hope, at the crowd of diverse species celebrating 50 years of peace and cooperation. Now they are family, she said. The girl considered this for a moment, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. To her generation, it did make perfect sense. They had never known a galaxy at war. They had only known a galaxy where different species worked together and helped each other. The idea that things had ever been different seemed strange and distant. This was the world humanity had built, not through conquest, but through kindness. Not through force, but through friendship. Not through proving their enemies wrong, but through showing everyone what was possible. The broadcast ended, and Chun turned off the screen. Outside, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in colors of gold and rose and purple. Tell us another story about the war, her oldest grandchild asked. Tell us about the Wraithkin. Chun laughed and settled back in her chair. There were so many stories to tell, so many memories of those difficult and beautiful years when everything had changed. The Wraithkin were the first aliens to become our friends. She began. And at the time, everyone thought we were crazy. They were the monsters of the galaxy, the nightmares that made other nightmares afraid. Her grandchildren leaned forward, eager to hear more. They loved these stories, tales of a time when friendship had seemed impossible, and yet it triumphed anyway. Chen talked late into the evening, sharing memories of the war that had changed everything. And as she talked, she felt profound gratitude for the galaxy her generation had helped create. The galaxy had banded together against humanity, and humanity had responded not with weapons, but with open hearts. 50 years later, the results spoke for themselves. Peace where there had been war, friendship where there had been fear, hope where there had been despair. It was not perfect. Nothing ever was. There were still conflicts, still misunderstandings, still moments when old fears resurfaced. But the direction was clear, the trajectory set. The future, brighter than anyone had dared to imagine, humanity had shown the galaxy what was possible. And the galaxy had chosen to believe, and that, Chen thought as she looked at her grandchildren's eager faces, was the greatest victory of all.